I'm Al McFarlane. Welcome to Conversations with Al McFarlane. Glad to be here and glad to have you along. This is a special day, and it's special to me. I think it's special to our country and to the world. I'm referring to the announcement in the past 20 minutes of guilty verdicts on most of the charges for the three people involved in the death of Ahmaud Arbery. Looking at top stories online from the Washington Post, for example, it says that jury reaches verdict in trial over Ahmaud Arbery's killing. Let me read that part of it here. Jury finds all three men guilty. Whoops, let me get this out of the way. It's not going to work. I have to sign on to something else. I'm trying to connect to the actual headlines here and share with the update. In the meantime, I want you, if you have been watching, monitoring the trial and the verdict in particular, I'd love to have your comments, your impressions, your thoughts, what it means to you. What did you expect and whether the outcome was different? Are you believing that the system worked or failed? Is justice what happened or not? So give me your thoughts and join the conversation. Now, if you're watching on Facebook, just send a direct message. I think we're monitoring our Facebook, and we can try to send you a link to have you come on camera through our StreamYard app and be part of this conversation. We think it's an important conversation for the nation, for all of us here. So let me see here. I just wanted to, I'm not being successful in calling up the story on my my phone here, but let me try a different one. One from ABC News says jury reaches verdict in Ahmaud Arbery death case, all found guilty of murder. Three white men were accused of killing the 25-year-old black man. This is a story posted today, about 4 minutes ago, from Bill Hutchinson from ABC News. The story says all three men guilty of murder in the killing of Ahmaud Arbery. ABC News Live and dozens of Black Lives Matter and Black Panther members gather outside the Glenn County Courthouse where the trial of Travis McMichael, his father Gregory McMichael, and William Roddy Bryan is being held. This is November. This is from 2 days ago, I guess it is. Okay, here's the story. It says a Georgia jury has convicted three white men of murder in the death of Ahmaud Arbery. Travis McMichael, who fatally shot Arbery in February of 2020, was convicted on all 9 charges, including malice murder and 4 counts of felony murder. McMichael's father, Gregory McMichael, age 65, was found not guilty of malice murder, but was convicted on the remaining charges, including the felony murder counts. The McMichael's neighbor, William Roddy Bryan, who's 53, was found guilty of 3 of the felony murder counts and a charge of criminal intent to commit a felony. The jury verdicts were read in court by the presiding judge in the case, Timothy Walmsley. The panel sent Walmsley a note on Wednesday afternoon that they had reached the verdict after deliberating about 11 hours over 2 days. The panel began deliberating the nationally televised trial on Tuesday after hearing 13 days of evidence and listening to numerous witnesses, including the testimony of defendant Travis McMichael, 35, who claimed he shot the unarmed Arbery with a shotgun in self-defense during a face-to-face fight over his weapon. The McMichaels and Bryan had all pleaded not guilty to a 9-count state indictment. The charges include malice murder, multiple charges of felony murder, false imprisonment, aggravated assault with a 12-gauge shotgun, aggravated assault with their pickup trucks. So the defendants all face a maximum sentence of life in prison. During the trial held in Brunswick, Georgia, the jury of 11 white people and one black person heard wildly different theories based on the same evidence in the racially charged case. Prosecutors allege the defendant pursued and murdered Arbery because of wrong assumptions and driveway decisions they made about the black man running through their neighborhood, that the black man running through their neighborhood had committed a burglary, while defense attorneys countered that Arbery was shot in self-defense when he resisted a citizen's arrest. The shooting unfolded on February 23, 2020, in the Satilla Shores neighborhood near Brunswick after Arbery, who prosecutors claim was just out for a Sunday jog, was spotted by a community resident inside a home that was under construction and where Arbery had been previously captured on security video looking around but never taking anything, according to the evidence. The chase of Arbery started when Gregory McMichael, a retired Glenn County police officer, spotted Arbery running past his home. Prosecutors said Gregory McMichael rushed into his residence to fetch his gun and his son Travis, who armed himself with a Remington pump-action shotgun before they got into a truck and chased after the black man. Brian, who lived next door to the McMichaels, who lived near the McMichaels, joined the chase, not knowing why the McMichaels were chasing Arbery, and told investigators that he used this truck to help corner Arbery just before Travis McMichaels shot him. What a story, what a story. So I'm interested if you can join this conversation in your thoughts, your feelings. I think this show appropriately opened with the music of the Sounds of Blackness, Time for Reparations, and somehow in my mind that theme is ringing loud and clear. I don't know how you feel about it, but my sense is that we're due for justice, and maybe, just maybe, this is a step in the right direction. I think that there was a common sense in the community, certainly in the Black community, that 11 white people in Georgia were not likely gonna be willing to convict white people for the death and murder of a black man. I can tell you that I'm a little surprised, but not unhappy by this decision, and prepared to applaud these citizens for having the courage to do what I believe is just and is apparently just in rendering judgment in these cases that are on trial. But I'm interested in your point of view. What do you think? Is this the right decision? Let me ask my producer, AZ, if we have anybody else in the studio yet. I've sent notices out sort of in the last few minutes asking people to join the conversation, but I want to extend it over to you who are listening on either YouTube or Facebook. And if you want to be part of the conversation, we'd love to have you in the conversation. In the meantime, what I'm going to do is go back to another music theme for a second. AZ, what other music do we have? And I'm going to keep posting to our social media and inviting people to come on to the conversation in the next few minutes. Do you have, I think let's play the Sounds of Blackness piece one more time. And while that piece is playing, I'll be reaching out through my other social media platforms to invite people to join the conversation. Would you do that, AZ?
It's time, it's time, it's time. I know it's time. The generation for reparation. Pay up, time to pay up. Reparation. Right now, reparation. It's really ours, you know it's you. Pay up, time to pay up. Right
Oh, Queen Justice, where are you? Did they beat you up or no? Lock you on the ground, take the crown away from you?
Oh, Lady Liberty, red, white, and blue. Did they take your dignity with their bigotry? Teach you that you're born to lose.
Free or guilty, it's gonna get filthy. Better believe, roll up your sleeves. It's gonna get rough, it's gonna be tough. We all agree, we've had enough.
We've had enough
Of all the rules you break,
We've had enough
of all the money you make.
We've had enough
No more life gets taken.
We've had enough.
This is a proclamation.
It's been 400 years and we're 400 late. Together we stand from state to state. Going back in time won't make America great. We need justice now, people won't wait.
Action, no more distraction. Every step we take, we gain traction. If it can happen to one, it can happen to all. United we stand, divided we fall. Free or guilty, it's gonna get filthy. Better believe, roll up your sleeves. It's gonna get rough, it's gonna be tough. We all agree, we've had enough.
We've had enough
Of all the rules you were breaking.
We had enough
Of all the money you were making.
We had enough
No more life gets taken.
We had enough
This is a proclamation.
Free or guilty,
It's gonna get filthy. You better believe.
just roll up your sleeves.
It's gonna get rough. It's gonna be tough. We all agree. We've had enough.
We've had enough
Of all the rules you're breaking,
We've had enough
all the money you're making,
We've had enough
no more life gets taken.
We've had enough
This is the proclamation.
We've had enough. Trayvon Martin and Tommy Rice. We've had enough. Michael Brown and Eric gonna pay the price.
We've had enough
Philando, Breonna, George Floyd.
What?
We've had enough. So many gone. How can we fill the void?
How could we feel
We had enough.
void?
John Crawford, I know you've heard. We've had enough. Sandra Bland, come on and take a stand. We've had enough. Sean Bell,
Sean Bell.
what the hell? We've had enough. Freddie Gray, did you hear what I said? We've had enough. This is a proclamation.
I'm Al McFarlane. Welcome back to Conversations with Al McFarlane. Music that captures the mood, the tenor of the day. Music asking us to reflect on all those who've been killed by police violence against Black bodies, Black and brown bodies, but also people that have been victims of violence within our own families, our own communities as well. This is a time to think about that, to reflect on it, and to move towards some sense of determination that we each have an obligation to pursue and to uphold justice, that we should expect our courts to deliver fairness and justice, and that we should do our part to ensure that systems and institutions, leaders are accountable, that we ourselves are accountable in being effective citizens of community, neighbors in community, voters, getting out the vote and making sure that our decisions are decisions that set the direction of the public life, of the civic life in our community. So I'm interested in getting your feedback on the outcome of the trial. As we mentioned earlier, the jury in Brunswick, Georgia, just delivered guilty charges against the three white men who were accused in the death of Ahmaud Arbery. And I think the son who actually pulled the trigger was convicted on all charges. His father was convicted on most of the charges, and the neighbor who joined them in attempting to corral or chase or corner Ahmaud also convicted on several of the charges. All three men now face the prospect of life in prison. And what's interesting to me is that this is kind of a sign of hope for me personally, whereas the verdict in the trial in Wisconsin, in Kenosha, gave me a different feeling. What happened in Kenosha? That young man charged in the murder of two, on the death of two men and the wounding of another, was acquitted by a jury that agreed that he acted in self-defense when he showed up at a protest in Kenosha, armed and under the auspices of saying he was going to be helping defend and protect property against people that were protesting in the community. And inadvertently, not inadvertently, but as a consequence, ended up shooting and killing two people, wounding a third. And we all remember seeing television footage of him walking down the street with his weapon, and military and police people driving right past him as if nothing had happened, and allowing him to sort of turn himself over to them, saying that he just shot people. Well, it turns out that after a court case that was televised in part, I think, and what people call theatrics by this young man, a sympathetic jury and certainly a sympathetic judge created a condition that allowed that jury to acquit this young man, on all the charges. So you had on the one hand what we expect, and that is that can you really count on white people to be fair and just? And when the issues of Black freedom, Black dignity are on the table, and even though the people that were shot in Wisconsin were not Black, and they may have been on the same side as the young man who was the shooter, the environment, the condition, the circumstance around protesting injustice against Black people. That's how these two people were killed and the other shot. And so there's this sense that that's kind of what they do. They will sort of cover for each other and interpret the law and the circumstances in ways that make them not accountable for loss of life in the situation. So that, I think, is what a lot of people had going into today's jury decision in Brunswick, Georgia. And I think with that in the background, some of us, I'll say I was a little bit surprised by the decision. Well, I'm joined by my colleague and friend, Dr. Irma McLaurin. Dr. McLaurin actually just sent another article in that I'm going to ask you to share. I haven't read it yet. I don't know the topic of it, but you're talking about this juxtaposition in the process. Dr. Irma, how are you?
I'm fine, especially after the second verdict. I literally just posted a piece on Medium that I will let you reprint called "The U.S. Justice System. The U.S. Justice has failed Black America again, and now white America is feeling it." Because I think it's important that the people who were harmed by Rittenhouse were white. Mm-hmm. And we sort of expect this, but it was unexpected. And the fact that he was able to walk away. And what I'd say is that he's brazenly allowed to walk free is proof positive that the American justice system has failed. And then there's all this discussion about the judge's demeanor. And I do want to say one thing. I did not watch this. And I think people need to understand that after watching the George Floyd trial and seeing our people break down, and particularly these young folks who were really traumatized by that experience, watching that on TV to me was almost akin to watching the Kennedy assassination or the Martin Luther King assassination. It is traumatic. And it is difficult, even when you want to write about this, to sit and listen to hours and hours and discussions about these trials. So I think people need to know. So I read the newspapers, I watch occasionally, but I can't subject myself as a way of me taking care of myself to sit and watch this like ongoing performance of whiteness. And what I basically say is that we already knew sort of what was going to happen. So the current findings, the jury verdict about the Albury trial is really, in some ways, a gift. It's almost like what happened with Chavis, which is that we weren't expecting it. We usually expect the system to fail us. And I think what's interesting is that we now have these two cases in which both of the people, both of the folks who were the perpetrators of violence, both go into these situations with a sense of entitlement, that they're entitled to act like vigilantes, that they're entitled to administer justice to Black people or to people who are protesting on behalf of Black people, that they have this entitlement. I mean, I say this at one point, I say, true story, a white supremacist young man, Kyle Rittenhouse, goes to a Black Lives Matter protest with a gun. Somebody dies, no SHIT, that's the punchline. Those who carry guns expect to use them. You don't go to a fight with a gun unless you're expected to use it. And so he went with the expectation that he was going to, as the Proud Boys were saying, that he was going to stand in. And that's what he did. And regardless of what happened is, and we have no evidence that there was violence perpetrated against him, but he used the classic statement, I feared for my life. We know that statement, right? It's a constant refrain that the police use whenever they want to justify killing another person of color, Black person, is that I feared for my life. Even when you walk into someone else's apartment, right? You can justify killing them by saying, I, as a white person, feared for my life. And that is the caveat. It is about whiteness. It is about the sense of entitlement. It is about white privilege on steroids. It is this sense that white fragility needs to be protected at all times and that people get away with it. And I think this is what's important, is that now white people understand if they put themselves in a position of alliance with Black movements and Black protests and Black civil unrest, they are vulnerable. They too can be killed because, in a sense, it becomes almost like they've been uninvited to the white social club, right? They've been banned, or they've been dismissed, and so it puts them in this liminal space. They're not Black, but they're also not us, meaning white people. So I'll stop there.
No, keep going. I mean, I think today, I'm trying to weigh how I feel. And I was saying before you joined us, Dr. Irma, that I feel like I need to acknowledge my doubt that was probably properly placed, but proved wrong, which is a good thing. I need to say something about that because I am satisfied that the improbable jury of 11 whites, 1 blacks delivered the verdicts that they delivered. And I think that that's worth talking about. And I think it's worth talking about the character and the courage of these 12 people to do what they did in an environment that we know historically, structurally, does not allow justice or verdicts like this to come forth. Not in Georgia, and as we know, not in Wisconsin, not in Kenosha.
And I think it's important to note that we're in a different moment than we were with the Chavis trial and George Floyd, that we had all of this sustained attention, national, global protests in the streets, and there was just kind of this momentum that was there. By the time we get to Rittenhouse, that is dissipated. But we also are in a moment of erasure. that we had this legislation that has been put in place in Iowa and other places where critical race theory has now become analogous to communism. It's like, are you one or have you ever been a critical race theorist? And if so, then you are immediately suspect. You are immediately sort of denigrated. And so we're in that moment. So it's a very different moment. And I want to take note of how quickly whites have transferred from really, having statements and platforms about supporting Black lives and Black Lives Matter to allowing this legislation to go in place in Iowa and other places where it becomes almost illegal to teach or talk about critical race theory, which, by the way, is never taught in K through 12. I mean, that's the irony. It's never taught in K through 12. It is a college level, graduate level kind of approach to sort of critical thinking, critical reading around racial hierarchies. What is happening in schools is people trying to get what they call culturally competent or culturally relevant content. So this idea that CRT is somehow going to damage children is really a kind of diversion. It's what, Agatha Christie used to call a red herring. It takes us away from what the real issue is, which is how is it that we are in a moment, if you've ever read Fahrenheit 451, where children are allowed to burn books in school, where we're being told what we can and cannot teach or think. Isn't that what we say, quote unquote, communism does? And yet this is all happening in the midst of what we consider to be an almost perfect democratic society. We're being censured. We're having legislation that not only censures us, but is going to have financial consequences if you violate it, right? We have an executive order that it's not clear to me if Biden ever dismissed it or dismantled it, which was the 45th president's executive order that made not only people in the federal government that they could not use, critical race theory, they could not talk about, racism or racial hierarchies, but it meant that if you had a contract with them, you were also subject to those same rules. So it was much broader than if you work for the government. It's if you have any affiliation, these were putting constraints. And what most people don't understand is that there was in there a number for people to then call in, just like they did under communism, and identify folks who they felt were violating that executive order. So we're almost now in a McCarthy-like environment around critical race theory and what I call the resurgence, the reclamation of whiteness. White people, and I use that as a generic term, and I'm not talking individuals, I'm talking about a mindset, I'm talking about a concept, I'm talking about a worldview that is clothed in whiteness, and you can have people of color who embrace that worldview so they can also walk with whiteness. I'm talking about this moment where people are they want to reclaim what it has been historically known as white power. They want the power over people, BIPOC people, any white people who agree with us. They want power over, and the only way to do that is to make it into legislation, is to use the political power and the white hierarchical structures that have been in place for decades, to use those to make that possible. And that's really important for people to understand. This is not about personalities or individuals. This is now about using structural power, political power, to advance a particular worldview, which is a white supremacist worldview.
And two critical elements of that strategy, Dr. Irma, were the last president's stacking of federal courts with so-called conservative judges, so that as issues of rights emerge and decisions had to be faced on local levels, those decisions would be always skewed against progressive ideas and against people of color and towards the maintenance of white supremacist thought of the power that they seek to preserve, the entitlement that they think they have. And the second part of this was, I think, well, the idea slipped my mind right now, but that was, this whole thing reminds me of the emergence of the Klan after
Yes.
Reconstruction. So this
Yes.
is the new iteration of a bid by a people and an idea, an ideology that is dying of its own moribundness. I think that's the
Yes.
right word, but it's in its effort to maintain itself and to morph into some kind of permanence,
Right.
and it's doing damage. It's prepared to do damage to the principles, the ideas of democracy, and to the lives of people that aren't part of that circle of white supremacist thought. It has a place for us, people who are not white. It has allocated and relegated a position for us to be supplicants, right, or to be subservient to their ideology, to their sense of entitlement. And if we go along with it, then we become the white supremacists ourselves. But the movement of the moment is our continued bid for justice, and our expectation that even a community like Decatur or Brunswick, Georgia, can produce a community of citizens that will do right. And that's what has happened today, I believe,
That's
and it's
right.
kind of surprising.
Yes, but it's necessary. I mean, we're at a moment now. This is not the fight for BIPOC people.
Mhm.
This is really a moment in which those who self-identify as white must take a stand.
Mhm.
You know, it's up to them to ensure that this fragile, imperfect democracy that we all claim we want to protect and uphold and see it, you know, really move into what could be a 21st century model. But it is in jeopardy at this moment because we're talking censure, we're talking censorship,
Mhm.
we're talking legal containment by, you know, legislation, and it can be state by state, but we've also had it at the federal level with executive orders. And I'm reminded of Frederick Douglass's statement: power concedes nothing without a demand. It never did and it never will. We have to demand that democracy be more perfect. We have to demand that the judicial system be truly fair and equitable and equal. And I think we saw that in Georgia, and we did not see it in Wisconsin.
I have some documents I used as part of an interview yesterday, talking with attorney Shelley Carthen Watson. I don't know if you knew her or not. She
Yeah.
was, she's presently the president and chief executive officer of the YWCA of Minneapolis. She previously was a a lawyer, a partner in the Robbins, Kaplan, Miller, and Cerisi law firm. She has a distinguished legal career. She called herself a recovering attorney. But we talked about critical race theory, and one of the documents I used to guide my conversation with her talked about critical race theory that asks us to consider how we can transform the relationship between race, racism, and power, and work towards the liberation of people of color. And so that's kind of a background. And this piece that I read identified the 5 basic tenets of critical race theory, the core components. And one, I'll just share with them and ask you to respond to them. And I'm synopsizing them as I read this. One is the centrality and the intersectionality of racism. 2 is to the challenge to dominant society, challenge in law and other arenas. Then the third one is the commitment to social justice. The fourth is the importance of experiential knowledge. And the fifth is the use of an interdisciplinary perspective. So critical race theory has those touch points as a way to move the entire society and community forward, to move away from the objectification or the separation of ideas and consequences, but move towards looking at how things do touch, how they do connect, and how that nothing is separated in our entire community and in existence. So I think that that's really important that we have this conversation. What do you think?
No, I mean, I think you're right. And I think we have, we have examples, and people have to be more historical, because some of what we're experiencing is not new. It seems new at this moment if you don't know the history, but it really is in some ways pushing us backwards. And when you start looking at documents and seeing the evidence of actions and acts and legislation that was done before, and I'll give you an example. When I
Mhm.
worked at Teach for America as the chief diversity officer, I was asked to speak in South Carolina. And as I was doing research, I came across a fact that the South Carolina legislature at one point had actually said that they would resist integration, after the Brown versus Board of Education.
Mhm.
And so when we look at inequality in the school system in South Carolina, we have to understand that that decision, that legislative policy was never dismantled. It was never erased. So what we see today is really built and predicated on this historical decision that was made. And even if you get new people coming in, it's kind of the bedrock. It's like the foundation of what, an unequal educational system is built upon. So we're going to have to go back and dismantle those things that are the foundation, of this sort of unequal system. And we have to, and the people who have to do it alongside us are people who self-identify as white or who walk with white power, because that's what's being protected. And the truth is, what working class whites don't seem to understand is that it's not really in their best interest. We saw after Reconstruction that Black legislators got into power because they aligned themselves with working class whites. But working class whites have been made to believe that it is in their best interest to put their foot on the neck of BIPOC people.
Mhm.
As Toni Morrison said, if if you are elevated because you put your foot on the neck of someone else, there's something wrong with that.
Yeah.
That's problematic. And so if you have to step on somebody else in order to just be better or to move yourself forward, that's a problem. And that's the moment we're in now. Power is something that you can have power over, which is what our history is in this
Mhm.
country around racial hierarchies and racialization. Or you can have power too, which is what the civil rights movement was about. And we're now at a moment where those who identify as white or who walk with white privilege and white power have to decide where they're going to lend their power. Is it going to be power over to oppress? Or is it going to be power to where it's advancing and making us move towards that, making democracy truly a perfect union?
You were a friend of the great author and thinker James Baldwin,
Yes.
and I just always, when I hear you talk about James Baldwin, and think that he was a guest in your home, that you knew him personally, it makes me say, "Wow!" I just love to hear you talk about that. But that makes me ask you, given his ability to examine the inner workings of the failure of our society, but also to have hope at the same time, what would he be saying, you think? How do you put a Baldwin lens into the events of today? Because when you look back at what he wrote 20, 30 years ago, it was almost prophetic.
Yes.
The principles he described are principles that are clearer now than they ever were. And they were radical at the time, but they're simply clear and true today.
I mean, I can't speak for Baldwin. So the
Of
first
course.
thing I would say is that people should read his work. It's time to pull, if you don't have copies, go online, get auto books. And, Netflix has some pieces of him speaking. The beauty for me is that I got to see James Baldwin when he was relaxed, when he felt he was among friends.
Mhm.
And there's a wonderful article that was done by some students in the Daily Collegiate where they interviewed people who knew him, and they called him the Pied Piper. There was a deep humanism about him. He really loved people, and it
Mhm.
didn't matter what you looked like. He just loved people, and he loved being around students, and he loved sharing his knowledge. And what people don't know, he didn't make a lot of money from that, but he just loved doing it. But he also had this critical lens where he was kind of the moral conscience of America, right? Even living in Paris, he was bringing that critical lens. And when you have that kind of intensity about being the moral compass, about being the moral voice, I call it the Cassandra syndrome, where Cassandra was the prophetic seer who could foretell the future, but was cursed with never being believed. And in some ways, Baldwin had that. People didn't believe what he was saying. He was both the chronicler of what was happening in America, not just Black America, but America through the lens of being Black. But he was also, in some ways, trying to he predates the support of LGBTQ with Giovanni's Room and his play about two men who love each other. We can see that now, but when he was writing about it back then, that was like taboo.
Yep.
So there is a kind of, I would say, let people read him and see how his words resonate today. They resonate to me because he talks about witnessing, that he was a witness. And when I write, I hold that idea in my mind that I am being a witness, that I am being able to say in words that people are thinking, but they can't quite translate. And so that becomes my the way in which I hold myself accountable is to use my words to tell the story and to say the things in a way that other people can then use them to support their arguments and the perspective they want. But this is definitely, I think he would talk about the fundamental contradictions that you have deaths in two cases, and one, the person walks scot-free, not even a slap on the wrist,
Mhm.
but completely scot-free. And in the other, these people are being held accountable, the perpetrators. And it is a white jury with one Black person in both cases that makes these very diametrically opposed and almost contradictory judgments and verdicts.
I'm looking at the upcoming edition of Insight News that we're working on today because of the holiday. We've sent to the printer already, but one of our lead stories says a great way to, quote unquote, listen to Black women is to elect them. It's a powerful headline, and it's important to me because you're doing the work of celebrating, elevating,
Yes.
archiving the voice of Black women and other people, but with the intentionality of recognizing and valuing the voice and the story of Black women. Talk about the archive, if you would.
Well, this was a wonderful past week because I was honored by the Association of the American Anthropological Association gave me one of the Engaged Anthropology Awards for the research and the work that I'd done as a diversity consultant for the Rochester Museum and Science Center. Huge exhibit that is no longer up, but that you can find the archives and a virtual tour online at Rochester Museum and Science Center that celebrated 200 women. But while I was at the meeting, I was able to actually connect with the Winter Grin Foundation has given me 2 grants, one to help process and ship my own archives, which ended up being 107 boxes in Gainesville, Florida. I finally closed out that storage unit after 17 years.
Well,
And the other is a global initiative grant in which I call it the Black Feminist Archive Pandemic Preservation Project. And that project is to identify Black women anthropologists, even though the archive is open to anyone, but I'm focused on Black women anthropologists who don't work inside colleges and universities. And so 2 people I connected with, Sheila Walker, who has spent a lifetime. She was in the university and then outside of it. And she's a documentarian. She has done books and documentary films on Afro Latinos because, contrary to people's belief, there are Black people in Argentina, Black people in Peru, Black people in Venezuela, Black people, and I'm talking people of African descent, right? So all these countries
And
have
what we don't know
Blackness.
is that there are more of us there than here.
Yes, than
And
here.
the
That's right.
illusion that we
And
live
Brazil
with
has
is
the
that,
largest number.
yeah,
Yes.
yeah.
Black people, so she has spent a lifetime documenting this. She told me she has like 5,000 slides. And she's been in all these countries. She's multilingual and she's continuing to do this work. So I was able to be in her home, which is almost like a museum with carvings and sculptures and, furniture that comes from all over the continent, right? And then the second person is that I was invited into the home of Audrey Smedley, who did a book called Race in North America, The Evolution and Development of an Idea. So her work, if you remember the PBS special called Race and Illusion, her work was fundamental to how they came, because what she talked about was racialized systems, that how race is understood and practiced in this country is not universal. It's different in other parts of the world, and we needed to understand that they have a different system. And so you can't look and compare as if they're the like thing. But what is stunning, and we estimated, I went through the attic and counting boxes and just kind of making a rough estimate that there are probably 150 boxes of material, finding handwritten notes. Here is the thing. Not any of the institutions that she has worked at asked for her papers.
Okay.
Now, this is a woman whose work has had a profound impact on anthropology, and she's not being revered. And that's good for me, because that means that I get to do that work. So the Irma McLaurin Black Feminist Archive, known as the Black Feminist Archive, is located at the University of Massachusetts Amherst. It is a repository. And the special collections, the Rob S. Cox Special Collections University Archives Research Center, focuses on collecting archives that deal with social change. So the greatest two collections they have is the W.E.B. Du Bois papers. There are over 99,000 items in that collection. And they also have a Du Bois Center, W.E.B. Du Bois Center, that is actually directed by Whitney Battle Baptiste, who is a Black archaeologist. And not only that, she is now the president-elect of the Association of American Anthropological Association. She will become the third Black woman in the history of this organization that's over 100 years old to be the president, in another year. So we're very pleased with that. So they have also just acquired a year ago the papers of Daniel Ellsberg. So I feel like my archive, which I see as an archival home for Black women, celebrating Black women who are activists, artists, academics, ordinary women who are mothers, who are community organizers, that we will be in good company, right? But we are carving out a space because historically archives have really been celebrating men, mostly white men. But even when they look at Blackness, they focus on men. So this archive is specifically devoted to women. It does not mean that there aren't men in it. Okay. It doesn't mean it's open to trans people, to men who see themselves as really allies of Black feminism. So I do have men in the thing. But its primary focus, and we just signed a memorandum of understanding, and I'm very proud of that, because often that doesn't happen. And the tenets of that memorandum is that, one, its main mission is to make Black women visible and heard, which of course you know about. And then second, it is to ensure that the contributors have agency in
Yeah.
shaping the narrative around how their material is going to be preserved. So it's not a question of turning it over to the library and then that's done, but it's actually having them involved in the process. And then the library has committed to making sure that as soon as they can, they digitize so that it's accessible to people. Um, and I can say right now, the Irma McLaurin papers, they've digitized 397 of my photos. It's in Credo, credo.umass, I think is it. But if you do my name and Credo, you can find it. I have at least 50 photographs of James Baldwin.
Wow.
And one of them is already on the cover of a book called The Three Mothers. It has appeared, it is a photograph of his mother, Emma Burtis Emma Burtis Jones Baldwin. She was this demure, this very sort of tiny woman who apparently had a lot of power, and really had a lot of presence in the community. So the book, The Three Mothers, is really about how the mothers of Malcolm, Martin Luther King, and James Baldwin really influenced them to become the people they are. And so that book has been talked about on MSNBC, on the Today Show, and I'm fortunate that they've been using my photograph.
Awesome.
And the author is actually going to be doing a TED Talk on the big stage, and they're going to be using my photograph. So I'm very pleased with that.
That's got to be a good feeling.
Yeah.
It's got to be a good feeling, though, to have assumed, the responsibility to hold really the world, our culture, accountable, and not in a way that blames, but in a way that takes up the mantle to say, here, we will do this, we will acknowledge, we will capture, we will preserve, we will celebrate, we will protect and preserve for all of history, and that in doing so, we're maintaining a record of a truth that too often has been ignored. Has been pushed aside, kept at the margin. And I'm thinking, Irma, the notes we were having on our mental, our worldview of Black people among us in this country, because I find it amazing that we think that we are the center, that we see ourselves in the context of our white captors.
Yes.
We define ourselves within the context of a broader definition of what the world is and what power is and what history is. And we allow ourselves to accept how we've been inserted in a narrative that we didn't create. While the truth of the matter is, the narrative that is more true and expansive and representative of who we are as human beings, and even who our oppressors are as human beings, is one that will be our path toward completion, fulfillment, actualization as individuals and as cultures and as human beings. That's what I believe. And so to find ways to break out of these restrictive tunnels of vision that are tunnels, that are structures, that are illusions, that keep us focused on our inability and away from our ability and our capacity, to the degree that we can be persistent and intentional in destroying those illusions and finding our way to freedom. I think that that's what time we're in today. That's where I see it. What do you think?
This archive becomes important because the excuse has always been we can't find any.
Right.
When we talk about the need for talent, the excuse was we can't find any. And if you look at, we have to shape our narrative because we're also being appropriated. If you look at like Ken Burns doesn't just go out in the streets and find stuff. He goes to archives. If we're not in the archives, we're not going to be in it. But if we also aren't part of shaping that story, like Ken Burns, the documentary he did on jazz, it's called An American Music. Well, why isn't it called an African American music? Right? I've gone into art museums and they have sculptures and things by Black artists. And I say, why are you calling this an American artist and why not an African American artist? And they're like, well, we're really struggling out. Well, why is it that you get to decide as a white curator what that is? Ask the person,
Or they'll
what is
say,
their history? And so there's also this appropriation. So I am being very intentional, and I am very happy to say, and I want to thank everyone who supported us. Keep doing it. You can do that at bit.ly/Black Femme Archive. But we have reached I've raised on my own with my own contributions, with birthday Facebooks, with friends and family giving donations. We have raised $25,000. So it is now officially an endowed endeavor. And we
great.
will continue to write grants, and the development office at the university is helping with this, because my vision is that we would have a McFarlane Black Feminist Archive Center, of which not only is it a repository, but to use it as a training ground to
Yes.
train Black women archivists. Because in the field, and this includes museum curators as well, they're all considered part of that profession. 84% of all archivists are white, and less than 4% are African American.
There we go. Well, that's
So
a statement.
who gets to tell the story and shape it if we're not in the profession, if we're not gathering the material which otherwise would be lost? We won't be in the formation of an American history. And that's what I am. I want to be a disruptor, an interrupter, an intervener, in making sure that that American narrative is complete. And it can't be complete if we're not in it. It can't. It will always be partial.
Exactly. So let me close with bringing you and I both back to the discussion of the hour, and that is the sentencing in Brunswick, Georgia, of the 3 white men who have now been charged and convicted of murder in the case of Ahmaud Arbery. What ought we be doing as a community in discussing, assessing, and moving both public policy and justice forward? What are your thoughts?
Well, I think one is to understand that America is filled with contradictions, and this is one where you have 2 very similar cases of perpetrators who were intentional about doing violence, against people whose ideology they did not believe in.
Mm-hmm.
And in one case, they were held accountable, and in the other, they're not. So one, I think we have to start holding institutions, whether they are schools, whether they are elected officials, whether they are colleges and universities, we have to start holding them accountable, and not just in words, not just in talk and in wonderful diversity statements, but in practice. What are you doing that makes that diversity statement real? What are you doing for equity? What are you doing to make things more inclusive? We have to start demanding that. I think we have to continue to read. People, while we have great writers and voices today, Ibram, Kendi Ibram and all of these, we have been saying this for decades. We've been saying this for centuries. And people need to go back and read those original voices as well, so that you can see side by side that in some ways it's still the same issue. It's still the same story. It's still the same struggle that Du Bois struggled with, that Douglass struggled with, that Frederick Douglass's wife, Mary Douglass, she never gets celebrated. And yet it was her idea for him to dress in clothes which she gave to him. It was her money as a laundress. There are like 30 statues of Douglass in Rochester, New York, and not one. Anna Marie Douglass, not one of her.
Yeah.
And so a colleague of mine, Rachel de Guzman, has begun an Anna Marie Douglass award, but also she produced, because they separated, he went off and married someone else. She produced a daughter and a granddaughter who then went on to become activists. So where are the women? So I'm always going to be lifting up the women in this. And we have to support, things like this. If you got a few pennies, not just UNCF, but also these kinds of things where we're trying to make sure that our story gets heard and told. So I think we're left with understanding that this country is not there yet, that we still have fundamental contradictions that could result into diametrically opposed, verdicts, for very similar actions. And we have to keep pushing against the systems to make sure that they end up being just. And I think we have to take seriously votes, not only about state legislatures, but about judges.
Mhm.
Read what they say, look at their records. And we have to keep pushing for the political vote. It may seem like it's not doing anything, but if we give that up, we will have given up what our people died for. They were lynched for, they were killed for, they were, harassed for.
Mhm.
And that is the power of the vote. We have to keep voting.
Dr. Earl McLaurin, thank you so much. Good to see you, my friend. And thank
Yes.
you. You have a great day.
Thank you.
I'm